DT11, which is the second part of the rescue management lecture that we covered last week. So what we're going to actually cover is personnel issues, things to do with media, instant reporting, and the legal process when fatalities occur. So this is kind of the peripheral stuff around rescue scene management. So we'll get straight into it. What sort of personnel issues can we have? So the first thing is thinking about your own rescuers. Typically, we've talked about this gut reaction in the past, where the first reaction isn't always the most kind of thought out action, and it can end up causing more casualties than reducing them. So as a rescue manager, your responsibility is to be aware of this sort of behavior and try and mitigate it. So a good way of doing that is giving people kind of duties or jobs. So, you do the defib, you do CPR, you do this, you go and, that sort of thing. Give people roles because it can make them feel like they're helping without allowing them to take action of their own volition and do something stupid. So if you told someone to do CPR, they're not going to then jump in the water and try and drag someone out because their job is CPR and it stops them doing that. So that's a good way of controlling that. Another thing we need to think about is crowd control. The fundamental concept to this is it needs to be firm but tactful. So people tend to like watching dramatic events, be that good or bad events, and diving incidents can be particularly dramatic or graphic in their nature just because of the type of injuries that are involved. The problem is if we have a crowd of people watching what's going on, they tend to get in the way and hinder rescue efforts. So we need to be firm but tactful. So we need to be kind of assertive, make sure that they know where the boundary is, know that they can't cross that. But we need to make sure that we don't cause another incident which draws resources away from that rescue that we're actually focusing on. Sometimes if you, for whatever reason, if you get someone who's aggressive towards the rescuers, it's best just to ignore them. Just let them go about venting their anger for whatever reason. So that's something to keep in mind. Also think about emotional reactions and shock of the relatives. So relatives of the people or the victims rather, they're going to require some sort of support if it's a traumatic event. Obviously don't force this on them if they don't want it, but it's important to kind of listen to them. That's often the best way of supporting them, is just listening to them. Don't give your own opinions or any sort of version of events that you see it, because that can tend to get kind of taken out of context by the relatives and might make them worse. And then in the case of fatalities, slightly more professional support might be needed. So this is often offered by the police. You can get it off BZAC HQ as well. So there's a little bit above our pay grade in that sense, really. It's also important to make sure that there we go, same thing. That we don't forget the relatives of the actual rescuers. So if they see on the TV that there's been an incident and a fatality at Stony Cove, and they know that you're at Stony Cove that day, then you need to make sure that they know it's not you, because that's quite an important part. You want to make sure you prevent any sort of needless worry. So that's another thing to consider as well. In terms of overall support, BZAC HQ are quite good for this sort of thing. So give them a ring, an email even, and they'll be very supportive in both kind of navigating the stuff we're going to come on to in terms of legal and media, but also just general support of those in distress. So moving on to media, this kind of extends from our crowd control a little bit. Generally, we want to keep the media away from the people involved in the rescue activities. They tend to get in the way more than normal people because they're trying to get good shots, good stories, all that sort of stuff. The safest course of action when interacting with these people is just to make no comment. If they ask for a question, just say no comment. The reason we do this because comments can be taken out of context very easily, especially in a kind of chaotic situation when you maybe not be focusing on what you're saying. Comments that you make can be sensationalized. Media are particularly guilty for this because of the headlines. They want to have an interesting, shocking headline. So if you say something that could be twisted in a certain way, diver says this, then that's going to be good for them, but obviously bad for you. And also you can then be kind of portrayed as criticizing or blaming people or the victim, which is never going to be a good thing. It's just going to make things worse. So it's important that you kind of avoid commenting on this sort of thing, and really on no account give any sort of personal details of any of the individuals, be that the victims or the rescuers. There's a number of reasons for this, but the main thing is we don't want to have relatives hear about casualties through the media first. We want to make sure that we're the ones telling them about this, because the media can be a little bit brutal on this sort of thing. In terms of instant reporting, so hopefully you're all fairly aware of this, but BZAC has an instant report form. So this is something that you'll fill out after the incident, and it gives BZAC some details on what happened, why it happened, how it happened, all that sort of thing. This is available from the BZAC HQ/website. I believe now it's entirely online. So if you just Google BZAC instant form, it's just an online form that you type information into and submit online, so it's not a paper thing anymore. It used to be. It's good to complete this soon after the rescue, just so you kind of have a good memory of it. The whole report is confidential. This isn't going to be published or anything with your name, so this isn't going to be a public document. The point of this instant report form is it's a mechanism to learn from these incidents and implement changes into the training schedule. So this is summarized and then published annually in the instant report form. If anyone's seen that or read it, it's quite an interesting read. Some of it's quite funny, some of it's not, but it is a useful tool to learn where other people made mistakes and perhaps where training could be improved. It monitors the trends and common causes of issues. So I think a common thing that's come up this instant, the fact that a good chunk of free flows are caused by inflating DSMBs with octopuses. So perhaps in the next year or two, we might see a change in the training administered in Sports Diver. Another example of this being employed is, in the past, it's quite an old technique, but buddy breathing, where you both breathe from a single regulator in an emergency situation. That used to be taught. It's no longer taught because the instant report showed that it was dangerous and it actually made things worse. So it's good for monitoring that. Same again for effectiveness and techniques. And again, like I said, it helps perfect the training schedule and training procedures. It's important that we report successful rescues and incidents as well. We need to know what went well as what went badly. If we just get bad reports, there's going to be a gap in the data that BZAC are using, so that's quite important as well. And yeah, the feedback from these incidents helps maintain that safety record of this sport. There's a slide at the end of this thing where I'll go over the safety record, but it's a very safe sport overall. So, okay, cheery topic: fatalities. So, safety record of this sport means fatalities are incredibly rare, like really rare. It's less than 1 in 100,000 people in the sport. And if you imagine how few people there are in diving, that's actually a really low chance of you getting killed. The legal process is quite important, particularly in a fatality. Generally, it involves the police and the coroner. Throughout the world, it varies. Different countries are going to have different processes. Even Scotland is different to England, so it does vary. So we're going to very quickly go over that. So what we're going to consider now is the role and responsibilities you have as a rescue manager, how the incident is investigated, some insights into the legal process, and what can we do as divers and as rescue managers to help this system and make sure that it works correctly. So a very quick overview of the UK legal systems. There's two things we need to know at this stage. Firstly, that they vary by locality. So in the England and Wales, we have the coroner. I'm sure you've probably heard of this. And these people are appointed by the council. Their job is to investigate sudden or kind of unexplained deaths. And typically they're a barrister, solicitor, or a doctor. And the whole point of their job is just to establish the cause of death. In Scotland, it's very similar. They have the Procurator Fiscal. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but that's generally a police-led investigation, and that reports to the Crown Prosecutor. So it's ever so slightly different, but the purpose of these is the same. It's to ascertain who has died, why, and when, as well as where. It is not to find someone guilty, apportion blame, try and establish who's at fault here. That's not the point of this. That comes later. The point of this is just to establish the facts and what happened. So that's the first thing that will happen. Then we'll have the opening hearing, which is held to identify the deceased. So they'll get a relative in of the deceased to identify the body, make sure it's the actual person we think it is, which is probably helpful. Then we'll have the results of the post-mortem. So this will basically consider whether the death is consistent with the suggested circumstances and whether it's all above board and correct. And then an interim death certificate will be issued. So this allows the family or people involved to process insurance policies and other legal documents. This is quite important because obviously there's a lot of legal documentation around someone's death. So this allows that to begin. Then it will be adjourned and investigations will begin. So this is carried out by the police. The first thing that they'll look at is the medical and past history of a diver. So did the person have a current medical certificate, which is why we're so hot on that on BZAC? Is there any medical problems in the past that might have influenced this accident? So there was a recent one in Stony Cove where a diver died 30 meters doing a rebreather dive, and he had a history of heart problems, and sure enough, he died from a heart attack at 30 meters. So that came up in the investigation and would suggest that's the cause of the incident. They'll also make inquiries to the branch and to their doctor, basically. So they're collecting medical information at that point. They'll also look at the dive profile, the dive history, and the experience. So is this diver diving beyond their capabilities or qualifications? They'll typically inquire with the diving officer and the training officer for the club as well, because they tend to know the divers and what they're capable of. They'll look at the conditions that the incident happened in. So were the conditions safe for diving? Was the diver familiar to these conditions? And then they'll have a look at the diver's equipment. Oh, skip well past that. Diver's equipment as well. So are they diving on known equipment to them, or is it new equipment? Are they trained in that equipment? So if they're diving on a rebreather, have they had rebreather training at all? Primarily, they'll be examining the equipment of the diver. So this is, I think we mentioned it last week, why it's important not to change anything on the kit, even turn the air off. Don't turn the air off. Leave the kit as it is, as you found it on the casualty, because they'll examine the kit. They'll look for faults. They'll look for lack of maintenance or misuse. Stuff like if a cylinder valve isn't open properly. So obviously, if you've turned the air off, that's going to hinder that investigation. So it's important you leave that diving equipment as you found it. Then we'll have the final hearing, which is basically evidence from the investigation and important witnesses. So those who are there on the day, the rescuers, that sort of thing. And then you'll get the verdict. So this final hearing could be a few months after the incident. The evidence given is typically by the police because they did the investigation, and the verdict, it can go many different ways. It could even be left as an open verdict where they establish that there's not enough evidence to actually give a conclusive reason for the death. So this is very kind of case by case basis, this stage. So what can we do as divers and as rescue managers? So the first thing is preservation of the scene. It's important, like I said, that we preserve the scene, make sure that the equipment isn't tampered with, make sure that rescue efforts aren't tampered with. It's also important to keep an incident log. So standard practice for us is to have a incident report as well as a casualty assessment form, and that'll help in the investigation as to what happened, how things unfolded on the actual day, what sequence of events happened. Times and actions taken and treatments given by the rescuers. It's also important that we retain that equipment, so make sure that the equipment's all together, protect from any interference. A lot of this I've already said, as well as collecting casualty and witness personal details. So we want to make sure that those who are at the scene, we've got contact details of, at the very least, phone numbers and a name. Ideally address and email and all that sort of stuff, just so the police or anyone investigating can then contact them afterwards. An important point here that is a little bit niche: do not offer to be an expert witness. So they may come up to you and say, are you willing to be an expert witness? Just say no, because it requires a certain amount of understanding of the legal system and of the technical side of things, which most divers do not have. It's also important because the insurance that we get through BZAC HQ requires referral to the BZAC HQ insurers when they request for a expert witness. So basically, this isn't our problem. Don't offer to be an expert witness. Cool. So putting it all in context, diving has a very good safety record. So to give you a little bit of numbers, because I think it's interesting, diving, like I said, has less than 1 in 100,000 deaths, okay, per person. So some comparisons to that is canoeing, which has a 10 times higher fatality rate. Hiking has a 6 times higher fatality rate. And then an interesting one, driving to Stony Cove, you're 15 times more likely to die just driving to Stony Cove than you are diving. And then a really random one, dance parties have the same fatality rate as scuba diving. Dance parties. So just to put it in context, scuba diving is incredibly safe if dance parties are beating us with fatality records. But the point is, this safety doesn't happen by accident. This is something that is a sustained effort by many, many, many divers across a wide range of areas of diving, be that instant reporting or general rescue scene management or just practicing your rescue skills. It's so important you do that. So that is literally it. It's a fairly short one, but it's a little bit drab. So I'll try to go through it fairly quickly. So what we've covered is some personnel issues, crowd control, giving people jobs, that sort of thing. We've talked about media and how to deal with the media, making sure you give no comment, making sure you give no personal details of either the victim or the rescuers. Talked about instant reporting, why it's important, where you do it online, and how it helps the training. Legal process and fatalities. So your role and responsibilities in that, how the investigation of the incident happens, and then a little bit of an insight into the legal process, as well as what we can do to help that process as well. So that's the end of the slides. Are there any sort of questions about that at all? I'm going to say that's a no then. That was a really quick one. So in that case, I will very quickly stop sharing that. I'll stop recording.